The radar screen pulsed with an ominous green glow as Senior Airman Marcus Webb leaned closer, his coffee growing cold in his trembling hand. It was 03:47 a.m. on a freezing November morning when the blip appeared, massive, deliberate, and heading straight toward the invisible line that separated Russian airspace from NATO territory. Webb had seen countless aircraft during his 3 years at the Forward Air Defense Station in Estonia, but nothing like this. The signature was unmistakable. A Tupolev Tu-160 Blackjack, Russia's most formidable strategic bomber, but it was flying a course that would bring it within miles of NATO airspace. What happened in the next 72 minutes would not only test the fragility of international peace, but reveal a secret that both sides had desperately tried to keep buried. Webb's fingers moved instinctively across the console, initiating the standard protocols. Within seconds, alarm klaxons echoed through the operations center, and sleepy-eyed personnel scrambled to their stations. Commander Sarah Mitchell burst through the door, her uniform jacket still unbuttoned, her face a mixture of concern and disbelief as she absorbed the information flooding the screens. The Tu-160 was no ordinary patrol flight. Its altitude was unusually low for a strategic bomber, and its transponder was broadcasting intermittently, creating gaps in the tracking data that made the aircraft seem to flicker in and out of existence like a ghost. The pattern was irregular, almost organic, as if something aboard the massive aircraft was fighting against its own systems. The Blackjack is not just any aircraft. Stretching over 177 feet with a wingspan that can extend to 182 feet in flight configuration, it remains the largest combat aircraft ever built and the heaviest supersonic bomber in operational service. Capable of carrying up to 40,000 kilograms of ordnance and flying at speeds exceeding Mach 2, the Tu-160 represents the pinnacle of Cold War-era engineering, updated with modern avionics that make it a formidable presence in any theater. Its 4 Kuznetsov NK-32 afterburning turbofan engines generate more thrust than any other military aircraft engine ever developed. When one approaches your border, you pay attention. When it behaves erratically, you prepare for the worst. When it refuses to respond to radio calls, you assume the unthinkable might be unfolding. Mitchell grabbed the secure phone, connecting directly to NATO Air Command. A report was terse and professional, but Webb could hear the tension threading through every word. The duty officer on the other end, a seasoned British colonel named Pemberton, absorbed the information with practiced calm before issuing orders that would ripple through the entire European theater. Within minutes, the decision came down from the chain of command to scramble the quick reaction alert fighters. At Emory Air Base, less than 20 miles away, 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons roared to life, their pilots, Captain James Razor Thornton and Lieutenant Emma Viper Kowalski, running through pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency even as they sprinted toward their aircraft. Both pilots were veterans of countless intercept missions, but as they strapped into their cockpits, both felt the weight of something different, something potentially historic about to unfold. The November sky was still pitch black when the F-16s punched through the cloud layer, their afterburners painting orange streaks across the darkness. Ground control vectored them toward the intercept point, feeding constant updates as the Blackjack continued its approach. Standard procedure dictated they would make visual contact, photograph the aircraft, and escort it away from NATO airspace if necessary. It was a dance both sides knew well, a routine that had played out hundreds of times since the end of the Cold War. Russian bombers would probe NATO defenses, NATO fighters would intercept and escort them, photographs would be taken, and everyone would return home with valuable intelligence and training experience. But nothing about this intercept would prove routine. Thornton spotted the massive bomber first, its swept wings creating an unmistakable silhouette against the twilight horizon. The bomber's white paint scheme, designed to reflect thermal radiation from nuclear blasts, seemed to glow with an ethereal quality in the pre-dawn light. As the F-16s closed to visual range, Thornton's practiced eye immediately noticed something wrong. The bomber's left inboard engine showed signs of thermal distress, a faint trail of vapor streaming behind it that suggested a serious mechanical problem. More disturbing was the bomber's flight path. It was weaving slightly,
the kind of shallow oscillations that indicated either autopilot malfunction or a pilot struggling with control inputs. The massive aircraft's nose would drift a few degrees off course, then correct, then drift again, like a drunk man trying to walk a straight line. Kowalski brought her F-16 alongside the bomber's cockpit, close enough to see through the glass. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The pilot's seat appeared to be occupied, but the figure wasn't moving. No acknowledgement of the NATO fighter's presence, no hand signals, nothing. Through her helmet-mounted camera, she could see the pilot's head lolled to one side, his oxygen mask hanging loose. The co-pilot position was visible as well, and that seat was clearly empty. She toggled her radio to the international emergency frequency and broadcast a message in both English and Russian, identifying herself and requesting the bomber acknowledge. Only static answered her call. She tried again and again, cycling through every frequency that Russian military aircraft might monitor. Nothing but the hiss of empty airwaves. Back at the operations center, Webb and Mitchell watched the unfolding situation with growing alarm. The Tu-160 had now crossed into the air defense identification zone, that buffer area where NATO begins tracking and responding to potential threats. Protocol required them to treat any unresponsive aircraft as potentially hostile. Yet rules of engagement also demanded restraint. This wasn't just any aircraft. It was a strategic bomber capable of carrying nuclear weapons, and shooting it down over Baltic waters could trigger a catastrophic international incident. Mitchell was on 3 separate phone lines simultaneously, coordinating with NATO headquarters in Brussels, the Pentagon, and European Air Defense Command. Each conversation was carefully documented, each decision justified and recorded, because everyone understood that history might judge their actions in the crucible of this moment. Additional radar stations across the Baltic region were now tracking the bomber. Operators in Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland added their data to the composite picture building in real time across NATO's integrated air defense network. Naval vessels in the Baltic Sea reported visual contact as the bomber passed overhead. Civilian air traffic across the region was being quietly diverted, commercial flights rerouted with minimal explanation to avoid potential danger zones. Behind the scenes, a massive coordinated response was taking shape with remarkable speed and efficiency. Then the Blackjack did something that changed everything. Instead of turning back toward Russian territory or continuing straight ahead, the massive bomber began a slow, graceful turn to the south. Thornton and Kowalski maintained formation, but now the bomber was heading toward Swedish airspace, threading the narrow corridor between NATO and neutral territory. The movement was too precise to be accidental, too deliberate to be the result of mechanical failure alone. Someone aboard that aircraft was flying it with purpose, but to what end? The turn was perfectly coordinated, the kind of smooth banking motion that suggested deliberate input rather than automated systems or random mechanical failure. The coded message arrived at Mitchell's terminal at 04:29 hours, flagged with the highest priority classification. It came from Russian military command through the special crisis communication channel established precisely for situations like this. The message was brief but explosive in its implications. The Tu-160 had been conducting a routine training mission when it experienced a catastrophic pressurization failure. The crew had lost consciousness from hypoxia. However, before blacking out, the pilot had engaged an emergency autopilot protocol that would guide the aircraft toward the nearest suitable landing field. That field, according to the programmed flight path, was not in Russia, but at a NATO airbase in Poland. The Russians were requesting emergency assistance and guaranteeing that the aircraft carried no weapons, only standard defensive equipment.
The revelation sent shockwaves through the command structure. A Russian strategic bomber, possibly carrying classified equipment, if not actual weapons, attempting to land at a NATO facility was unprecedented in the post-Cold War era. The political implications were staggering. Was this a genuine emergency or an elaborate defection? Could it be a Trojan horse operation, with the crew planning to destroy the aircraft and its sensitive technology on NATO soil? Or was it exactly what the Russians claimed, a desperate attempt by a dying pilot to save his aircraft and himself? Intelligence officers scrambled to verify the Russian claims,
cross-referencing flight patterns, communications intercepts, and satellite data to determine if the story held up under scrutiny. Mitchell made the decision that would define her career. They would allow the approach, but under the strictest conditions. The T-160 would be escorted every mile of the way, with additional fighters joining from Germany and Poland. Emergency crews would be standing by, but so would counterintelligence teams and explosive ordnance disposal units. If this was a defection, they would secure the aircraft. If it was a deception, they would be ready to respond. She authorized the transmission of her decision up the chain of command, knowing that generals and politicians across 2 continents would be weighing in, second-guessing, preparing their own responses. The tension escalated further when intelligence analysts detected unusual encrypted transmissions emanating from the bomber itself. The signals were weak, intermittent, and unlike any standard Russian military communications protocol. Speculation ran wild through the command center. Was someone aboard the aircraft trying to communicate? Was it an automated distress system activating? Or perhaps most alarmingly, could it be a remote detonation signal being jammed by the aircraft's own damaged systems? Mitchell ordered electronic warfare specialists to monitor every frequency, recording everything for later analysis, while ensuring nothing could trigger an unwanted response from whatever systems remained active aboard the stricken bomber. Technicians worked frantically to isolate and decode the signals, running them through every known Russian military encryption system. Meanwhile, diplomatic channels were burning white-hot with activity. The Russian ambassador was awakened and brought to an emergency meeting at the Foreign Ministry. American officials were simultaneously briefing the White House Situation Room and coordinating with European allies. Every major capital, from London to Berlin, received minute-by-minute updates. The incident was quickly spiraling beyond a simple aviation emergency into a full-blown international crisis that demanded the attention of the highest levels of government. In Moscow, military officials were conducting their own emergency meetings, calculating the intelligence loss if NATO gained access to the T-160 systems, weighing that against the propaganda disaster of refusing to cooperate in a genuine emergency. Media blackout orders were issued, but in the age of social media and flight tracking applications, keeping the situation quiet was proving impossible. Civilian observers across Eastern Europe were posting videos of the unprecedented formation, a Russian strategic bomber surrounded by NATO fighters, flying deeper into Western airspace with each passing moment. News agencies were beginning to pick up the story, breathless reporters speculating about everything from defections to equipment failures to elaborate deceptions. The narrative was escaping official control, taking on a life of its own in the digital sphere. As dawn broke over the Baltic, an unprecedented aerial convoy took shape. The massive Blackjack, trailing its vapor signature like a wounded giant, flew at the center of a formation of 8 NATO fighters from 4 different countries. Swedish Gripens had joined the escort, maintaining a respectful distance in neutral airspace, but ready to intervene if the bomber deviated toward Stockholm. German Eurofighters had scrambled from their base to add additional coverage. Polish F-16s were climbing to altitude, ready to take over escort duties as the formation approached their territory. The site was captured by a dozen civilian aircraft and ships, their photographs and videos flooding social media within minutes, despite military attempts to maintain operational security. The images were stunning. The white giant surrounded by smaller gray fighters, all flying in tight formation as the sun painted the clouds below in shades of pink and gold. The approach to the Polish base at Łask was textbook perfect, the automated systems guiding the bomber with inhuman precision. Air traffic controllers cleared a 20-mile radius around the base, grounding all other aircraft. Emergency vehicles staged at strategic points along the runway. Fire trucks, ambulances, crash recovery equipment. Military police established security perimeters. As the landing gear deployed and the massive aircraft settled toward the runway, emergency vehicles raced alongside, their lights painting the tarmac in strobing colors. Medical teams stood ready to rush to the aircraft the moment it stopped. The Tu-160 touched down with surprising gentleness, its drag chute deploying perfectly as it decelerated along the runway's length. The massive aircraft rolled for what seemed like an eternity before finally coming to rest 3/4 of the way down the 10,000-foot runway. What emerged in the following hours was a story of technological failure, human courage, and the razor-thin line between cooperation and confrontation that defines modern international relations. The pilot, Colonel Alexei Volkov, had indeed succumbed to hypoxia, but had managed to program the emergency landing protocol before losing consciousness. Medical teams found him unconscious, but alive, his body temperature dangerously low, his blood oxygen levels critically depleted. They stabilized him quickly, working alongside Russian medical personnel who had arrived on a separate aircraft within hours of the landing. His co-pilot, who should have been present, had been grounded at the last minute due to illness, a piece of luck that probably saved the aircraft from a far more chaotic end with 2 unconscious pilots. The aircraft itself became the subject of intense negotiation. Russian recovery teams arrived within hours, but NATO insisted on a thorough inspection before allowing the aircraft's removal. What they found vindicated both sides' concerns and hopes: sophisticated but purely conventional equipment, along with evidence of the mechanical failures that had triggered the crisis. The pressurization system had suffered a catastrophic seal failure, a maintenance issue that investigators would later trace to improper installation of replacement parts during a recent overhaul. No weapons were present, no classified materials beyond the aircraft's own systems. After 3 days of diplomatic wrangling, with technical teams from both sides working around the clock to repair the damaged systems, the Tu-160 departed Polish soil under its own power, escorted back to Russian airspace by the same multinational force that had brought it in. Colonel Volkov recovered fully and was quietly decorated by his government for his actions under extreme duress. Commander Mitchell received a commendation for her handling of the crisis, though the recognition came with classified caveats that acknowledged how easily the situation could have spiraled into disaster. But the real story, the one that military analysts and historians would study for years, was how close the world had come to a potentially catastrophic misunderstanding, and how professionalism and communication had prevailed over suspicion and fear. The incident established new protocols for handling similar emergencies, creating direct communication channels and shared procedures that would serve both sides in future crises. Joint exercises were quietly organized to practice coordinated responses to aviation emergencies that crossed political boundaries. What could have been a tragedy or a trigger for conflict instead became a template for cooperation, proving that even in an era of renewed tensions, common sense and shared humanity could still find a path through the darkness. The shadow over the Baltic had passed, but the lessons it taught continued to illuminate the delicate balance of power and peace.